Okay, well, welcome everyone to um, this May edition 2024 of the collaboration between University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University. We're happy to have you all here today, listening and learning a little bit more about the industry. Today, we'll have the two speakers that are going to talk are myself and then also Jalen Whaley, who we have as part of our collaborators, who currently works on the west side. I don't know if that's the appropriate way to put it, Jalen, on the west side of South Dakota and as a field specialist. I've known Jalen a while, and she is an expert in a lot of different things, sheep and also wool. She came from University of Wyoming with her master's and her undergraduate degree, and I feel lucky to know her and learn from her. She's done a lot of great work in the industry for carcass evaluations in our slaughter plants, and she brings a depth of knowledge. So I'll let her go ahead and introduce her topic, and she can take it away from there. Thank you, Jalen.
Oops. Yeah, thanks, Chad. I appreciate the introduction. And as Chad said, came from the University of Wyoming, but before that, grew up in Colorado with definitely what I would call a multi-species operation. And so this has kind of been something that has always been important growing up. And I think that there's so many opportunities for this moving forward. And so I think what we have to think about, first things first, if you're thinking about incorporating multiple species on your operation, we really have to look at the big picture. So starting with what is your goal for that pasture? Is it purely to increase biodiversity? We know that by selecting for various forages as opposed to one, we can help boost that both plant and animal biodiversity on our pastures. Or maybe you just have a nuisance weed that you want to get rid of, or something that's maybe toxic to cattle that our sheep and goats can handle a little better. But it also proposes an opportunity for just some additional income as well. And we'll talk through each of these a little bit more later. But before you make that leap, it's also important that you recognize what types of plants are in your pasture. If you don't have forbs there already in abundance, chances are you're probably not going to obviously increase the number of forbs that are in your pastures. And so we have to look at the dietary overlap of our species that we're utilizing, and then looking at our existing diversity of plant type. And then finally, calculating that carrying capacity, or knowing how many animals your pasture can support. And that's where it varies so greatly across the country, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But the neat thing is that with multi-species grazing, you can increase your carrying capacity by 10 to 25%. So starting with grazing behavior of our different, specifically our ruminant species is what I'm going to focus on today. As we move from cattle to sheep to goats, we do see an increase in selectivity. And so you can kind of see as we talk through this figure on the right that actually comes from our own Melinda Ellison. And I will drop the link to that article that she put out. But I just think this is a really awesome figure to show all of the grazing behavior differences in our different livestock species. And so as you can see, our cattle are typically going to graze predominantly grasses. They're going to graze those flatter areas of our pasture, and they're going to have the lowest amount of selectivity. If you sit and watch cows eat, they have a big muzzle and a big tongue, and they just make big sweeps. And they're going to not be nearly as selective on what they're eating. Then as we move into our sheep, they tend to fall into the middle. And our goats then are the most selective, will graze the most number of things like shrubs and forbs, and are willing to go, further from water, up steeper grades, things like that. Another thing to keep in mind for multiple reasons is that our small ruminants will graze closer to the ground. And so that's an advantage if you have a pasture that has a lot of short forbs or some of our short grasses. we can increase pasture utilization of some of those forage species. But then we also have to consider the fact that we really have to watch our overgrazing there as well. As I mentioned, our goats are going to graze more woody species. So if you have concern with maybe things like an invasive red cedar or something of that sort, goats are really good for some of those woody encroachment species. The other neat thing about our small ruminants is that they do tend to change their diet composition based on a couple of different things than cattle will. So if you run those sheep or goats with your cattle, chances are that they'll start to select those other species that the cattle aren't selecting for, as long as they're available. And then also, those sheep and goats are going to select for the higher quality feedstuffs. And as we get into winter, we know that our forbs and our browse tend to have higher nutrient values. And so we do see that sheep graze more of our forbs in the summer, but then we'll switch more into a browse type species in the winter. And we see that a lot with some of the research done in and around Utah and Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, that area, where sheep will actually graze a pretty large proportion of sagebrush in the winter. I just want to give a really big overview really quick of our different types of grazing systems. Obviously, we start with probably the least labor intensive, and that's just our continuous grazing. That's where we graze our livestock on one pasture for a long period or an entire grazing season. This is where our animals are kind of just free to graze wherever and whatever they want. Typically here you'll see cattle tend to travel not as far from water, where our sheep and goats will travel a little bit further. But we have no control over what they're grazing if we really want to try to manage specific plant species. And then also we have less uniform pasture utilization, because if they congregate or camp somewhere, we have no way to move them out of those areas. And so typically we're going to see a lot less uniform pasture utilization. Just like if we were at a buffet, and we know we should probably eat a salad, but we definitely want to hit the dessert bar first. We might see overgrazing of certain plants that are more palatable. And so again, if we're really wanting to target a specific type of plant, you might see overgrazing of some of the more palatable options. And then here in our continuous systems, it's really important that we're managing our stocking density. If you were on early, you heard Chad and I talking about how here in Western South Dakota, we've gotten quite a bit of rain this spring, which has been really nice. And so hopefully we can manage our stocking density a little higher than normal this year. Fingers crossed our pasture conditions stay good. And so then if we switch over, we then have kind of the opposite, maybe a little bit more labor intensive option, and that's our controlled grazing systems. Typically, these are going to be smaller areas because we're limiting the amount of time that those animals are there, and we're moving them more frequently. However, there has been a lot of studies that show that managing this way can help increase our plant diversity. And so when we look at controlled grazing, there's really three different types. There's strip grazing, where we would put in temporary fencing and move those animals down the strips of the pasture. We hear a lot about our rotational grazing and rotating in between certain pastures. And then I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but our focus today is going to be largely on targeted grazing. And Chad will elaborate much more in depth on that later. So when we look at our controlled grazing methods, like I mentioned, we do see better pasture utilization because we're targeting what those animals or where those animals are eating. We are going to see consumption of those less palatable plants. You do have the opportunity to extend your grazing season, because typically we're grazing those strips or little paddocks a little bit closer, and we're actually able to manage the amount of time that those animals are spending grazing, so we can extend our grazing season. And we also have better manure distribution. So those animals aren't congregating somewhere. You can actually heavily fertilize your pastures a little bit more carefully. Of course, we have to look at some of the concerns though when we get into some controlled grazing. And I think the biggest thing that kind of steers people away from worrying about it, I guess, is it is typically a higher cost, especially if you're using a targeted grazing or strip grazing where you need temporary fencing. It is more labor because you have to move those animals more frequently. And not every pasture is going to be ideal for our control grazing. If you've got a pasture that maybe has a few more hills or a lot more clay pan type soils, our topography isn't always going to be super conducive to this controlled grazing. Water is also usually a major concern when we're worried about or when we're controlled grazing, making sure that there is water available in those pastures or paddocks at all times. And sometimes if we're using something like if our only water source is a stock dam, it might be a little bit more difficult to manage those controlled pastures. And then we also have the potential if those aren't managed closely and we're not paying attention. Of course, this can happen in any situation, but we do have the potential to over or undergraze individual pastures or paddocks. So one of the big questions I get when we talk about multi-species grazing is, well, who goes first? Do I put the cows in first? Do I put the sheep in first? Or do I graze them together? And unfortunately, I'm going to give you maybe the stereotypical extension answer of it depends. It solely depends on what your production goals for that pasture are. So if you want to run those species together, there are quite a few benefits. As I mentioned before, just the presence of those cattle may force sheep or goats towards some of those areas that maybe they wouldn't be grazing normally. It'll push those sheep towards those high forb and browse areas. As I mentioned, our sheep and goats are much more willing to graze hillsides than our cattle are, so it might push the sheep there. And our sheep and goats also are willing to travel a lot further from water, so you're going to get better pasture utilization on those areas that are much further from your water source. I always recommend to start with a 1-to-1 ratio, and then you can always adjust. So if you've got 100 cows in a pasture, just start with potentially 100 ewes or something like that. If you're looking at it from an animal unit perspective, we usually look at 1 AU, which is a 1,000-pound cow and her calf, right, as 5 ewes or about 6 goats. And we could do a whole lesson on calculating AUM. You can do that based on like relative body weights as well. But just as a general rule of thumb, usually we're going about 1 cow to 5 ewes or 6 goats. But to prevent that overgrazing and overconsumption of plants, we want to make sure to maybe start a little lower than that. So I usually recommend to start with a 1-to-1. The other benefit to running your cattle with your small ruminants is they can sometimes serve as predator control. If you've ever been chased by a big mean mama cow, it's pretty understandable why coyotes would stay out as well. But just the presence of having a larger animal in that pasture can serve as an aid to predator control, which is kind of nice as well. And then, as I mentioned, those things just lead to greater pasture utilization. If you don't want to graze them at the same time, or perhaps have different goals in mind, we do want to put sheep and goats in first, usually if we're trying to manage for some kind of weed control. Most of the time we want to graze those weeds early before they have the opportunity to seed. And they're much more palatable as younger plants also. And so if you're trying to control something like larkspur, leafy spurge, we want to put our sheep and goats in first. Plus we know things like leafy spurge or larkspur are toxic to cattle. And so we want to get obviously those plants under control before our cows go in. Whereas we might use cattle first as a parasite control method. So we know that our barber pole worm is a concern in our small ruminants, but it's not a concern in cattle. And so they can actually serve as an end host for that parasite and decrease your parasite burden on pastures. One thing to also consider is matching your nutrient requirements. And so, if we're not lambing until late spring, and we've got open ewes through the majority of fall when our pastures are not as high of quality, that's where our fall and winter grazing can come in, because those ewes are just in a maintenance diet, or maybe kind of you're warming up for breeding season, whereas our cattle potentially are bred. And so matching our nutrient requirements of our pastures is really important too. If there's a stage where maybe you're running some yearling cattle, but you've got ewe lamb pairs, maybe put your ewe lamb pairs out on that higher quality pasture first, because they have the higher nutrient requirement needs. And so just some things to consider if you're gonna run one or the other first. The other thing to keep in mind is we don't want to twice overgraze. And so make sure that you're following those one species almost immediately to the other, because that's going to promote more of our native grass species. And so diving a little bit further into matching our nutrient requirements, because I think that's really key to making sure that our animals are successful, because that's at the end of the day our overall goal, right? And so consider putting either lactating or bred females on that higher nutritional pasture. The other thing that is really nice to think about is usually our ewes and our does spend a lot more time in a maintenance diet. We wean those kids and lambs earlier, their gestation is shorter. And so, like in some cases, our ewes will spend up to 4 months in maintenance. And so there we're looking at a difference between 2% of their body weight intake in maintenance versus 3 to 4% of their body weight when they're in lactation or gestation. And so in a grazing season, that's about 180 pounds of feed less per ewe when she's in a maintenance diet. And so that makes sheep and goats really nice when we're trying to consider stretching our pastures and doing some fall or winter grazing, because they don't need as nutrient dense of a diet at that point as our cattle do. The thing that's probably gaining in the most popularity has been using our small ruminants for weed control. And of course, this can always be intensive or extensive as you prefer. You can certainly multi-species graze in a continuous grazing system, knowing that those animals are going to select for those. But with greater intensity comes greater results. And so the more targeted we can make our grazing systems, the better results, I guess, you'll see on some of that weed control. As I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure to graze those weeds before they mature in seed. It's because those plants are more palatable when they're younger. But also we're stopping those plants before they can hit their reproductive stages. That's not to say that you can't graze those plants after they've seeded, because digestion does decrease future viability of seeds. I was reading a paper on leafy spurge, and if we graze it when it comes to seed, we decrease the viability of those seeds by about 50%. So it's never going to be 100%. You're still going to get some of those seeds passing and being viable in that animal's manure, but it does decrease the viability. Keep in mind that when we transition sheep and goats over to wanting them to have that very targeted weed control, it may require a training period. If those animals have never grazed something like Dalmatian toadflax before, or even our leafy spurge or larkspur, they may not, I guess, be apt to naturally go towards those plants. And so if we can really train them to want to eat those plants, my predecessor up here in South Dakota did a study on Dalmatian toadflax up in the Black Hills, and they found that at the first little bit, those ewes did not want to, that's the last thing they touched was the toadflax. But once that was the only thing they had to eat, when they switched them to a new pasture, that was the first thing they grazed in the next pasture. And so one of those things that I would recommend is if you are looking at getting some sheep or goats to graze a specific weed, if you don't have them already, consider maybe buying sheep or goats from a producer that either has been grazing those individual plants, or those sheep or goats come from an area that those plants are present. And then also, I just always tell producers, if you're starting on a multi-species system, give yourself a little bit of grace, because it can take up to 3 years before you really notice results. And so be patient, give it some time, but expect, at least 3 years before you notice substantial results. So I'm going to answer Q&A while we're here. So someone asked about using legume seeds and mineral tubs to be dispersed in this through the manure. And I have anecdotally heard of people doing that. Again, I think the caveat there is, like I mentioned, that your seed viability isn't 100%. And so you can put like your alfalfa in with your mineral tubs or with a loose mineral. And chances are you will see some legumes kind of quote unquote interseeded in your pastures. But it won't be nearly to the extent that you would if you were to actually go out and interseed. But that is something that is an easier option. Just know that it's not going to be nearly as effective as going out and planting. So I'm going to focus just on a couple of different species. Leafy spurge is one that we see, especially up here, that is being targeted for because it does cause digestional upset and things like that in our cattle. And it's extremely expensive to spray for, but sheep and goats graze it extremely well. And the nice thing about leafy spurge also is that it is relatively high in crude protein and it is highly digestible. And so we actually do see a potential for higher average daily gains. And this is one of those plants, just like larkspur or some of our like juniper species, which I'll talk about in a minute, where our cattle might experience negative impacts from tannin consumption, but our sheep and goats don't. And so you can see this was a study done in North Dakota in the late 90s. And you can see one side of the fence where there was no sheep grazed compared to the other side that they're running cattle in now. And then 2 years later, once sheep had grazed both sides of those pastures, that leafy spurge was basically eliminated. And I'm actually working with a producer now that just sent me a text this morning that he watched, and some mature ewes that he knew came from a producer that grazes leafy spurge. Those mature ewes were actually selecting for it, whereas his young yearling ewes that he bought weren't selecting for it yet. But it definitely is a learned behavior. But that's where it's really neat to see those animals that have learned to eat these things and how they can impact pastures. Looking at juniper, this is something that our goats are going to consume extremely well. On average, usually we're looking at about 20% of their diet being juniper, but they can consume up to 50%. And so if you look at the table here, if we do that math based on juniper intake, and a 100-pound goat, those high juniper intake 100-pound goats are going to be consuming almost 1.5 pounds of juniper a day. And so we really have the ability to select against that juniper. And we saw similar results up here in South Dakota on eastern red cedar as well. In general, goats are going to tend to prefer that younger juniper, again, largely due to probably palatability. And this is a learned behavior. And so if you've got does and kids in an area together, those kids are going to learn to eat things like juniper or some of your other undesirables, just from being around those mature animals. And so using our small ruminants in general can be an effective tool to control some of these woody species or undesirable forb species. And then we can also use that in combination with other methods like control burning or spraying, things like that. I don't know why I'm having issues with my slides advancing. There we go. Okay. So I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper on parasite control as well, just because it is our top concern across the country for small ruminant producers. And what's neat is that if you have the opportunity to run some cattle, they will break that life cycle of our barber pole worm, just because they're not nearly as affected by it as our small ruminants are. It's important to keep in mind that those larvae can travel, 3 to 4 inches up the plant. So we really don't want to graze much below, really that 4 inches is a hard stop, but that's where we have to prevent overgrazing. We also have to consider like our spring turnouts now, if your grasses aren't nearly as tall as they normally are yet, because they're just starting to grow. We have to consider our parasite burdens there as well. And so if you know you have a low parasite load on that pasture, you can go ahead and graze it with your sheep and cattle together. But if you've had a history of parasite problems on a pasture, you may consider grazing your cattle first. Just some quick touch on just some startup considerations. I think the big thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to recreate the wheel to incorporate small ruminants into an operation. So how can your current facilities either work for sheep and goats, or can they be adapted? Are you willing to just go ahead and put up some portable sheep panels? Or could you use existing corral fence with some maybe modifications to design some sorting alleys that aren't going to take up more space and labor? I usually get a lot of questions about fencing also when it comes to multi-species grazing. And that's going to be largely dependent on how hard you're trying to graze. So like in our targeted grazing systems, you probably are going to have a little bit more robust like electrical fencing or electronet. But I have seen producers be very successful with targeted grazing, even with just 2 poly wires. That same producer that I mentioned earlier, we were talking through some fencing this morning, and he said that he's using 3 poly wire right now, but he actually prefers the electronet just because it's a little bit less labor, and he knows he can keep those sheep a little bit safer. So it's whatever you prefer, but it definitely doesn't have to be as labor intensive as I think some people think. And then also just consider your guardian animals. Our livestock guard dogs and things like that obviously are well adapted to our small ruminants, but can also be good guardians for our cattle too. And so consider those in your small ruminant system also. I am going to go ahead and address another Q&A question here because I think it's something that I don't have on here, but it's a really good consideration if you are going to run 2 different species. And so there's a question about the different mineral requirements. So obviously our sheep can't have copper, but our goats need to have copper. And same with our cattle. So that's a really good point. And that's where you may consider, they make like an all stock mineral, but chances are those probably are not high enough in copper for your goats or your cattle. And so that's where we have to be really cognizant about maybe not running those animals together. A lot of times, in the summer months when our plants are in a really high nutrient value stage, our pastures will meet a maintenance mineral requirement. And so minerals may not even be needed. But again, I would really encourage you to test your forages and make sure that we're meeting those mineral requirements. But keeping in mind that if you want to run those species together, making sure that a high copper mineral is not out there if the sheep are. So yeah, very good point that I did not put in here. So then I kind of want to conclude mostly with just looking at the economic benefits, because obviously our pastures are important, but at the end of the day, we still have to have a profitable business. And so the benefits here to multi-species grazing are your increased returns per acre, because we can run the same amount of acreage, but have more animals. And so you are actually increasing the amount of profit per acre. Plus, when we look at our sheep and goats, we have the potential for multiple offspring. And so that always adds an extra boost to our return on investment. Having multiple species also improves your cash flow, because we know that those markets fluctuate at very different times. And so when the cattle market's down or the sheep market's down, that's when we can sell, some goat kids, and hopefully their market's up. And a lot of times when you look at the different market averages, we do see seasonal fluctuations that complement each other. And plus, we know that we're functioning on different production timelines, right? We don't usually, unless you really want to challenge your sanity, lamb or calf and kid at the same time. And so our production timelines are very different for each of those species. And because we're increasing the number of stock, most of the time our fixed cost per animal unit is going to decrease. So we can spread out a lot of our fixed costs across the animal enterprises. But do be cognizant of some of your potential changes in variable costs. And then finally, I always promote our small ruminants because they do tend to have a quicker return on investment. Just partially because we're a multiple bearing species, most years a ewe or doe should be able to pay for herself within the first year. And so you already cover the cost of that female within her first year just with her offspring, plus the opportunity to have some additional profit as well. So just some final thoughts to conclude. Start by taking an inventory of your plant species, because if you have plants out there, or if you don't have specific plants out there, sheep and goats will still graze grass. And so we don't want to negatively hurt any of our other plant species. So making sure that you know what's out there, but also taking an annual forage inventory to know if your stocking rates could go up this year. We could have a little bit more carrying capacity this year maybe than in years past. And then next is just determining what system is going to match your goals. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And so who needs to graze first, or do you need to switch to some kind of more intensive target grazing type system? And then, like I mentioned before, start with that 1-to-1 ratio and then adjust. It's really important that when we're trying to make these changes, that we do give ourselves grace as producers and know that, okay, well, maybe that didn't quite work this year. We'll have to do something different. Or we may not have gotten the reduction in plant species this year, but let's try it again next year. And so being willing to just be flexible and make adjustments to accomplish your goals. And so with that, I will stop sharing and take some Q&A while Chad pulls up his presentation. So someone asked, if cattle break the barber pole worm, should I let cattle graze below 4 inches? From a forage management standpoint, I would still say no. I mean, it depends on the plant species. We typically tend to use that take half, leave half perspective when it comes to grazing. And so most of the time, grazing below 4 inches is going to be considered overgrazing on that plant species anyway. So I still would advise not to graze below 3 to 4 inches, mostly for a plant health perspective. And I think that's all I have for now for Q&A, Chad. So
Awesome.
Yeah, I will turn things over to Chad.
Hey, thank you, Jalen. I think that's really informative. I hope everyone can see my screen kind of in the presentation mode. Today I was going to talk a little bit about targeted grazing, and by no means am I an expert in this category. Just kind of looking and dabbling and showing some of the research that we've started to do here at USU, and some other successful stories utilizing small ruminants specifically to do targeted grazing. I really like some of the questions that we've had today, so keep those rolling so we can keep this interactive. So as we go, I just wanted to first kind of define, I think it's important to do that, define what targeted grazing really is and how it applies to some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So the definition that I'm going to kind of use today and to point out is it's the application of a specific kind of livestock. So this could be cows, sheep, goats, or ruminant species we're talking about today, at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish a defined vegetation or landscape goal. So I think it's really important to point out that oftentimes when we're doing targeted grazing, we're not necessarily doing it to achieve objectives or goals with our animal production system. Usually we're trying to do it in order to accomplish some kind of vegetation or landscape goal, maybe to open up more space for grass species by grazing out leafy spurge or something to that extent. And so when we talk about the kind of livestock species that we're using, usually when we talk about our small ruminants, that's kind of the tool that we're utilizing in order to graze the different vegetation that we have available to us. And so we know that sheep and goats graze very differently than cattle. And so Jalen did a really good job kind of pointing out that goats, sheep, and cattle all graze slightly differently. Sheep and cattle have a little bit more overlap than goats. But if you were to kind of break up the different categories of grass, forbs, and browse, cattle prefer grass over everything and then hit forbs and browse. Sheep generally hit forbs and then go to grass and then browse. And goats usually actually are pretty browsy, and we'll show a little bit of that actually later in the presentation. So this image here comes from an older book on nutrition that I really like, but I think it helps point out why sheep and goats actually make a really good tool for using for doing targeted grazing on some things, especially certain plant species that we're trying to hit. And so sheep and goats are known a little bit more selective, right? In this category, it has sheep kind of more as a roughage eater with cattle, but generally cattle, um, I consider them more of like a lawnmower, where a sheep can be a little bit more selective in that it seeks out those forbs, as maybe gets closer to the ground, like Jalen said. Where our goats actually, they really stand out and they become very selective. And their feeding bouts are actually different throughout the day. So if you kind of look at this bottom portion, you'll see that even their rumens have developed slightly different between some of these concentrate selectors and some of these bulk grazers, and how often they have feeding bouts, and then also how fast feed goes through their digestive system. Um, Even to the point that their salivary glands are even different across these species. And so if you look at some of our concentrate selectors in this top left corner, you can see that as percentage of their body weight, our concentrate selectors do have larger salivary glands in comparison to our cattle. Now, cattle are very large, so they do produce a ton of saliva. But when we look at it as percentage of the body, pound for pound, some of these anatomical features are very different between those animals that are very browsy and those that are just kind of bulk grazers. And so this also gives another really good indicator. One thing I like about this image is it kind of shows between the bulk grazers and our concentrate selectors that even the liver size is usually bigger in comparison to the body than some of our bulk grazers like cattle. This may be, one of the reasons that some of our small ruminant species can handle some of those plants like tall larkspur a little bit better, and that they've adapted to be able to handle those. So I like to tell people a sheep is not a small cow, a goat is not a small cow. All these animals are very individual, even on an anatomical level. So knowing these things about our small ruminants that make them different, there's been a large amount of wild success stories in our small ruminant world, right? And so Jalen talked a little bit about leafy spurge and had some great pictures. This has been a really good um, case study to show how well small ruminants do on a particular plant that maybe some of our bulk grazers like cattle don't do very well at. And even in my short amount of time in Montana, I met some cattle and sheep producers who combined their businesses in order to target graze some of this prior to cattle coming through some of these areas. Another really good success story is grazing kudzu in the south is another thing that we hear a lot about. I can kind of go on and on all these different success stories, but I think matching the right animal or tool, since we're trying to really accomplish a landscape goal, having the right animal as a tool to accomplish this is really important. Even so much so that um, even our energy sector has started to see this, right? And although here in Utah, we don't see this really blowing up as a huge opportunity for sheep producers here under solar farms in the South, Midwest, East Coast, we see that there are ample opportunities for some of these sheep producers to come in and graze some of these solar farms. They're really the perfect tool to accomplish this objective because they're fairly low to the ground. They can get up under the panels. They're not too harsh on equipment, whereas maybe goats are a little bit rougher on equipment, and then cattle are a little bit harsher on things also, and maybe not able to get under some of these solar panels quite as easily. And so this has been a great opportunity for a lot of sheep producers in the South, and they've been trying to change their management strategies in order to match this, to meet that objective given to them by these companies. Another thing that we're starting to see and that is really being marketed as a very green alternative, even in urban areas or on national parks, is utilizing small ruminants to come in and do some short duration, high intensity grazing. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But here's a great example of an urban area where uh, a bunch of goats came in, and within a short amount of time, because we packed them in very densely, they're able to graze down a lot of weeds, some of that weed control that Jalen talked about. Now, between the two species, there are different things to worry about, right? So seed heads in wool may be one of them, or passing through some of those viable seeds in feces is another thing. And so if you go to from one location to another and there are different plant species, some of the recommendations are often that you take those animals, dry lot them in order for those seeds to pass through the digestive system before you move to the next location, especially if you're grazing some very noxious type weeds. So one thing that is very popular right now, and you could look up almost any YouTube video or talk to anyone, is really kind of talking about this short duration, high intensity grazing. Um, there are many different things about it. I think as we implement this kind of grazing, it's really important to point out that the reason we do this is so that we limit the opportunity for our animals to graze more preferentially. So we want our animals in a smaller space. We want them there um, with many animals, and so that the available forage they have will be consumed more equally, and they'll be essentially, in some instances, essentially forced to graze a certain feed that may not always be desirable to them, right? And so in continuous grazing systems, often this is kind of the opposite, right? So we put animals out in very low stocking densities for a longer period of time, and we allow these animals to choose and select for the forages that they deem most palatable and then maybe most nutritious. But as we kind of move up in intensity and stocking density, we do it for a shorter duration of time, and we're generally confining them to a smaller space. So this has been looked at as a way to do more targeted grazing. And Jalen talked a little bit about using different kind of fencing in order to do this. And so I kind of wanted today to talk about a project that we did here at Utah State last summer. And so I worked closely with the Department of Natural Resources and was approached by them to talk about doing some targeted grazing in a wildlife refuge area. And this area had actually been kind of overrun with different invasive weeds, largely in the form of field bindweed. And so this is kind of what happened with us and how we went about designing this small project to kind of see how we could handle field bindweed in this area. And so our objective here was, it wasn't to grow our goats as well as we could. It wasn't to grow our sheep as well as we could. It was to increase mule deer winter habitat by reducing invasive weed species and increasing browse species through short duration, high intensity sheep and goat grazing. Okay. And so kind of goes back to that original definition, is we weren't going in this with our main objective of being growing our animals as well as we could, or hitting those nutrient requirements that we know they need. We were trying to accomplish our objective of the landscape. And so the study area we're in was in Richmond, Utah. It's kind of up near the mountains. And once we got there, we didn't know exactly what weed species we were dealing with, but we found out pretty soon that we were dealing with some areas of almost pure monocultures of field bindweed. Now, this is a weed that is in the morning glory family, I believe. And then there are some things I've learned about this plant that since then has really surprised me. And so one of the things being that the seeds are viable up to 50 years in the soil, and that the roots can go down roughly 10 feet. So even if you were to dig under the soil 4 feet, chop them off at their roots, a lot of times these roots will still grow back. And so it's a very formidable enemy, I think, on a landscape to try to get rid of. And those of you who deal with this in your garden, this probably um, is a good reminder of what gardening season is about to be. A lot of pulling this stuff. I know I have to pull it in my own garden. Here's another good example of that kind of in a garden setting. So the way we designed this study is I got a couple good undergrads to help me out, and a graduate student. And what we really wanted to look at with the Department of Natural Resources is how does this type of greener alternative of utilizing small ruminants, sheep and goats on the landscape hold up to chemical alternatives. So what we did is we stacked up this high intensity grazing with against herbicide use on the weeds, and then grazing and herbicide use on the weeds. Now, we don't fully have all our results. We need to go out again this year and get more results, but I do have some data on some of the preference of these animals and then also the production aspect of it. So when I was originally approached, I wanted to know, well, we can accomplish the goal, right? The vegetation goal for targeted grazing, but what is going to happen to our animals? Because ultimately, as livestock producers, we make money in a certain way. So if we're not going to make money by growing our animals, does there need to be alternative incentive monetarily in order to accomplish these grazing goals? And so we used 40 kind of polypay rambouillet ewes out in these pastures, and you could see there was a pretty good amount of forage growth. And then we used 40 Spanish and Spanish boar does out on these pastures. So here's one area. About each paddock was almost an acre in size, and we usually rotated through them within 3 days. And so you can see that it kind of looks like a farm field that was plowed. It's because originally the Department of Natural Resources went in and tried to rip out and do some of their own weed control, and it was pretty unsuccessful. And so this is our attempt to utilize the animals coming in. You can see how much they expose the bare ground even in a very short amount of time. In the background, you can see some rose bushes, and these rose bushes were actually hit pretty good by our goats, right? One thing I was surprised to see is that the sheep tend to eat the field bindweed better than the goats did, which was somewhat surprising to me. The goats generally seeked out other things. So I had students going out morning and night and essentially doing bite counts, watching animals for a given amount of time and trying to watch to see exactly what they're eating and taking notes of it. And when we tallied it up, it seemed like the sheep actually did a better job. The one takeaway portion that I really wanted to bring to producers or us today is the impact that it has. This kind of grazing may or may not have on your operation. And so with our sheep that we went out, and bear in mind, these sheep had lambs weaned off of them shortly before, several weeks before we brought them out to the site. And even though they were in that maintenance period, grazing the field bindweed, we took away all their preferences and we kind of forced them onto eating that. We saw that they lost some weight. Now, our goats also lost weight, and actually more substantially across this. And I just wanted to remind us that roughly 12 to 14% of a mature body weight is equivalent to one body condition score. And so here in this instance with goats, we're roughly dropping half to a full body condition score with these goats, which could have impacts on your production setting. Are you getting ready to breed these animals and things like that? So I think it's really important to kind of think of what animals am I going to use if I have an opportunity to do targeted grazing in general, because sometimes even if it's offered up as, well, here's a free opportunity to graze this, maybe the deal is you fix the fence. But if there's production loss on top of fixing fence, even with a free feed, it may or may not pencil out for you. And I think it's important to look at the bigger picture of things. Another thing to think about is for what animals you're using. What is the expected growth? Are they in milk production? Do you have open animals that maybe you can afford to use? Um, and what are the short-term and long-term impacts this may have on your operation? Generally, in larger range operations, sometimes in operations that are maybe rotational grazing, we try to really line up our nutrient demands with forage growth, right? Because we want to minimize the amount of time that we spend giving them harvested feedstuffs. The thing is, though, when we look at these cool season and warm season growth patterns, usually those invasive plants that we're trying to target graze usually pop up sooner in the year. And so that may affect your production cycle. So if you have opportunity to go and graze um, a specific plant, and it could be many, and it's popping up earlier than some of the other cool season and warm season grasses, you may want to shift your lambing season or your kidding season earlier so that you can actually get out. So you're not actually like in your lambing barn or kidding barn when maybe you should be out targeted grazing that particular plant. And so it's really important to think about that time of season, stage of production, and all these other aspects. But ultimately, kind of comes back to you're trying to reach the objective of the vegetative state on the landscape. So while targeted grazing does a really good job increasing rangeland sustainability, it helps meet vegetative management goals, and it is opening tons of opportunities to our small ruminant producers across the US. If you have these opportunities, I strongly suggest that you weigh out all the options and potential impacts on your operation. Will you be losing some body condition score as you take away the animal's preference to different feed types? What are the nutrient demands for that stage of production? Is it a lactating doe that you have out grazing, and are her nutritional needs being met? And so some of the research, if you go out and you're trying to get them to target graze a certain thing, it's very much a learned behavior, like Jalen said. But if you try to supplement them in order to meet their nutrient needs, you may just create an animal that waits for you to come supplement them every day, and they may not actually work as a tool like you were hoping. And so really, what are the objectives of your operation? Are your objectives on the animal side? Can you find a happy medium? Ultimately, is this a sustainable model for what you're trying to do? And so kind of with that, um, I'm open to take any questions. I see there are a couple in the Q&A right now. So the first one, so if you're trying to convince your cattle producer friends to begin a sheep production, what should be top messaging points with possibly redoing fences and facilities? Um, I I don't know. Do you want to answer that one, Jalen, or do you want that kind of goes with your talk a little bit more? So maybe I'll let you hammer that one, and then I'll put in my 2 bits.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think here in South Dakota, we joke a lot that Western South Dakota was founded on sheep, and now they have cattle for prestige, and that's a big joke up here. But it is sometimes hard to convince those cattle producers that redoing fences and facilities is hard. And so that's where I think if we can talk with them, I talk with a lot of producers about the fact that if you buy sheep from a producer that's been raising sheep where, a lot of the ewes here are managed under a 4-wire fence, maybe 5. And so in some cases, all they have to do is string 1 more wire, which I know fencing costs are not cheap right now, but there's not the need for necessarily completely redoing it or putting in woven wire. And I think just having those conversations with them about how do we take your facilities now and adapt them. And so I've seen where people will essentially build their sheep alley along a fence line that maybe they don't use as often in the corrals, or find ways to use what their existing systems for their cattle and how we can make them work. And so I think it's having that conversation of being flexible and realizing that we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can make small adaptations rather than complete transformations.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, if you're trying to get some sheep or goats to utilize them as a tool, so a call I get sometimes, it kind of goes back to your slide on juniper, is some cattlemen will call me, they'll say, hey, how should I manage these goats around trying to, you know, tame down this encroaching juniper that's coming across the landscape, and utilize it essentially to produce a product. And so sometimes it can be as easy as buying so many strands worth of electric fencing and then utilize that to kind of control them in a given environment. And that is a pretty good tool too. And that isn't super costly in comparison to trying to redo all your fencing around an operation. And so if you have one area that's tight enough to hold them, and then maybe some not so permanent fencing like electric fencing, that seems to work pretty well. So one thing, when you introduce sheep to electric fencing, try to do it after shearing, because then you get some better conductivity. If they have a full fleece on them and you stick them out to introduce them to electric fencing, sometimes you might not get the same effects. Sometimes they'll just be laying up against that wire and it'll be arcing, and sometimes they're so insulated from it, it doesn't seem to do anything. There was another comment about the copper aspect. And I'll just speak to that real quick. And so there's a comment to say we'll increase different minerals that are antagonistic to copper, like zinc. Iron is another one. But I think what is a much safer thing to do is to just make sure that they're getting the right mineral. I know that there's some people exploring kind of almost like a creep feed scenario for their smaller ruminants, whether it's goats or sheep. But the biggest thing is just to really make sure that the sheep stay out of the high copper. And so if you had, you know, goats and sheep together, maybe you feed a free choice sheep mineral with low copper. The copper is still, you still have to eat some copper for sheep, or you'll get some things like steely wool and stuff like that. But you know, maybe in some areas, if you have access to things like copper boluses, that could be an option. So you have a free choice mineral and then you give a copper bolus, that could be an option. And so there are different ways to get about it, but the main thing would just, because of that sensitivity to sheep, I would just manage for that mainly. So another question is there some experience to use sheep or goats with horses? I guess the question I would have with this is in what sense? I don't know. What do you think, Jalen?
I guess my first thought goes back to kind of our same grazing behavior conversation. And horses are gonna graze a bit more like a cow, where they're not nearly as selective. They'll graze much closer to the ground typically than a cow will. And so I think that there is still probably some complementarity there, I guess would be my initial thought. The consideration that I would maybe think about is even some people don't graze their cattle and horses together because the cattle have the horses have the potential of thinking they need to do their job and herd that livestock around the pastures. I've even seen that, some concern with that on donkeys as a guardian animal. So that would be, I guess, maybe my thoughts is from a grazing aspect, there probably is some complementarity there.
Awesome. Yeah, and I haven't had experience managing horses in a grazing scenario. Other than in Utah, we have a lot of talk on feral horses on a landscape, but that's a whole different story. So I'm moving on to kind of the next set of questions, there was a question on what time of year junipers are most palatable for sheep and goats. And I would say that generally they prefer younger plant species, and so, or new growth on it. And so that would be what they're kind of selecting for first and foremost. Um, on those. So some of your younger juniper plants will actually get hurt. Not so much necessarily the time of year, other than when growth is actively happening. They'll select for those buds. And the other question was, how was the water and mineral supplied in the wildlife management area? That's a really good question that I didn't go into detail on, but I will real quick. So if you look at kind of the map here, what we ended up doing, because we were also trying to manage for predators, is we actually took some T-posts and cattle panels, and we made a permanent night pen here. And then so every night, every morning and every night, we let sheep out to graze during the day, the sheep and goats. And then at night, the students put the animals back away. And this goes back to Jay Lynn's comment on how much more intensive it is to try to do targeted grazing, and that there's a lot more man hours put into this. And so these students went out every morning and every night to push these sheep in and out. In this night pen area is where we had all the water troughs and we had all the mineral available to these animals. And we managed for the sheep. So we didn't supplement any additional copper to the goats in this particular scenario. But so we had everything here. So this area was kind of sacrificial in that they just completely destroyed any vegetative growth in this area and in the runway that they had access in each paddock to get back to that night pen. Was hammered really hard. So it was just kind of a runway that was a sacrifice. But so we hauled water up there because we couldn't have these sheep and goats in these riparian areas, right? There is actually a creek that runs back here, and we couldn't have the animals in these areas because that wasn't the landscape objective. Our objective was to try to graze those weedy areas which ran through this portion of the allotment. And so that's a big portion of this is, what do you have the ability to do? How much is it going to cost you to haul water, man hours, all these different things. So that's a great question. Thank you.
There's a follow-up to that, Chad. So basically, just a clarifier, so those animals only had access to water at night.
No, they had access to water during the whole day. And so if, say, I had that night pen in this second paddock, the herbicide only, so they never grazed it, but maybe the paddock was on the back end, they would essentially have a runway to it throughout the whole day, and then they could graze that whole paddock, which was roughly the size of an acre. But through the whole day, they always had access to get back to water and mineral. Good question.
We'll just stay, I guess, on some follow-up questions on that study. So having that holding area, did you see any problems with parasites?
No, as far as like clinical signs, like we didn't see any bottle jaw or anemic state or anything like that, but we also didn't do fecal samples. And so if there were parasite issues, they weren't clinical signs. Maybe there were subclinical cases that just weren't documented in this case. And so this whole trial only lasted about a month before we were unable to continue it. So
And it was just a single year study so far, right, Chad?
right. Yeah, I think for the amount of work it took, I would need more money to try to do it, right? So, but I think that goes back to us as producers. If we have opportunity to graze, it needs to pencil out for us. Like we can't just be doing it as a service to people. And so if you have an opportunity, pencil it out, make sure that it actually works and that your animals aren't going to suffer too much, or if they do lose some condition, make sure that you're compensated accordingly. So
So then there was a question about basically managing stress. So what steps can you take and during short duration mob grazing to give sheep so that they're not in under the stress of small feed spaces?
I mean, unfortunately, I think that kind of comes with the scenario. That little bit of amount of stress or anxiety that maybe that animal has also forces them to compete more grazing, right? So instead of being as selective, spreading out, finding the feed that they want, they're more likely to eat what's in front of them. I think you would agree with me in saying that, right, Jalen? And
Yeah.
so there is a small amount of that. One concern I had running the goats with the sheep is I was afraid the goats were going to beat up on the sheep too much, especially because the goats we run at USU are all horned. We don't dehorn anything here. And so that was a concern of mine, but it ended up doing pretty well. They usually separated themselves and grazed differently throughout the paddocks, but it went pretty well. But I think there's needs to be a certain amount of stress in order to accomplish that goal. I hope I'm answering that right. So
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is um, the age groups that you're grazing. So if you're trying to graze some mature ewes with some maybe ewe lambs or young ewes, um, our yearling ewes are not going to be nearly as competitive for what they want against those older ewes. And so maybe just consider, I don't know, like if your guys' study had mixed ages, Chad, or
no, I kept ours very uniform in age. The goats had some more variation in age, but all my ewes were like yearlings to 2 year olds. Like they were very young ewes. So
yep.
all of them had lambed though. So there is a question, Jalen, do we recommend any mineral? As far as a company, I'm not going to recommend any. I would say that talking to getting a hold of us and making sure that those minerals are in the right quantity is important. And I think it's really important to also think that just because what it says on the mineral package is not necessarily what your animal is getting in their total diet. So if there is some copper on a sheep package, say it's a low parts per million copper, um, they're not, and it's that seems above toxicity level. Well, they're not consuming just mineral all day long. They're consuming grass and hay and everything else with low copper concentrations, and then they're consuming generally a couple ounces of mineral. And so you need to calculate it out as if they're just consuming that small amount and look at the parts per million copper of total copper consumed within the day. And so some people get very scared with copper in their mineral supplement for sheep. But if it's in the right concentration, it doesn't generally throw any alarms for me. So
Yeah, and like Chad said, there is still a copper requirement. And so I know here, there's a few spots here in Western South Dakota where I've worked with producers struggling with copper deficiency in their sheep. And so I would agree with Chad. I don't know that there's one company that I recommend, just making sure that you're reading that mineral. And I really do think that our mineral companies do a good job of making sure that they're producing a high quality product. So just
I
making
Yeah, I agree with you, Jalen. I think they try to do as good as they can. It's a balance between what is profitable to them and also what is the best product because you could put that thing with the most organic types of minerals that are super bioavailable, more palatable, but it costs a lot more than maybe like a zinc sulfate versus like a zinc amino acid complex. And so it's a balancing act for them in their business also. So there's a question on we have a similar setup with uh as far as like that alleyway, the corridor back to the paddocks for rotational grazing. And there was some warning on parasite buildup because of grazing over the same area so often. And this is definitely something to think about, especially if you're in that area all the time. I think why it wasn't a problem in this very short study is we were only there a month. We were only in each paddock, so many days, and there might have not have been big parasite loads on this pasture already. But if that's your home setup and you're doing it year after year, that is definitely something you want to think about. The guys who can get around that usually have their paddock set up for rotational grazing where they have to have a water source in every single paddock. And that can be difficult to do instead of just running a corridor back to a central location. Um, but it is something that I know people do when they have successful setups. But rotational grazing, targeted grazing in general, always lends itself to, especially rotational grazing year in and year out in the same area, almost a perfect microclimate for some of these parasites, especially if you're doing irrigated pastures. So that's a big thing to think about, but oftentimes it seems to be something you have to manage for, and you can mitigate that by getting water in every or shade in every paddock, but it is sometimes difficult. So
Well, or
good.
I would even recommend like sometimes switching up your not always grazing from paddock 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every year. Mix it up because that's good for your plant species also.
Yeah. Yeah.
So last question for you, Chad, before we close today.
Sure.
Was there a reason that you guys went with your polypay and more Spanish as opposed to something different?
Honestly, this is what we had available at the university. And so here at USU, we do a lot of cloning type research. And so we're in the need of a very prolific breed of sheep. And so we kind of have the Polypay Rambouillet cross right now because Polypays originally were developed in Idaho. And so they kind of mimic a little bit more of a Western white face breed with still having a lot of replacement females for us to choose from for embryo transfer when we do a lot of the cloning that we do. And then the Spanish boar cross, I think is a pretty good representation of the industry also. We're slowly kind of switching to more of a boar influence, but we do like that cross here. And so it's more of just what was available for us. We weren't really looking for a specific breed type, but I think both kind of represent the area pretty well. So at least the larger industries. Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone
Well,